Hey guys, we're back up in the Power Rankings for Survivor 49 following episode 8, which was a bit of a slower episode if I'm being honest, though still led to some interesting results here, but with that soon enough. But we have 10 people to talk about, and let's spend some more time. Let's go into the video. So starting off at number 10, we had the latest boo from the season, and here we have MC. And MC had a bit of an interesting downfall here where she goes through some fallout through her idol play with people talking about how they couldn't trust her, but the bigger move comes once we get to the scramble before tribal, where she does end up telling Jawan about this plan that Sophie has to throw a vote into him in case Rizzo plays his idol, which gets back to Sophie and the rest of the tribe to where it does cause her to become a target. And obviously her leaking this whole plan to Jawan in the first place seemed pretty unnecessary and was definitely a suboptimal move there. Now, she does explain in her exit interview that she did it for reasons outside the game, where she was worried that Jawan could have been taken out there and in turn continue this trend of black players being voted out as split tribals in the new era, which, to be fair, she's not wrong. I mean, there has been like this trend where most of the people vote out at these split tribals are POC, but that still doesn't make the decision to leak the plan to Jawan any less misguided, especially when Jawan didn't seem to have that much loyalty to her when he seemed pretty willing to flip on her at the point where the plan did shift to her. And I also suspect that her hyper focus on this trend of POC being voted out in New Era Split Tribals could also just be a byproduct of her being such a recent fan of the show, where, considering she had just gotten to the show in the past year, that the New Era seasons probably had a massive influence in how she views the game more generally. And I feel like someone like MC may be a bit more concerned about recent trends like this, as opposed to people who had been watching the show for longer. So I do feel like those things probably all came together to MC like wanting to at least try to make a move like this, even though by the end it didn't work, and ironically, she ends up being another number for this trend here. But if we were talking about MC more generally, I mean, I feel like she was a fine enough player where it did seem like she was in a very good spot on her original Hina tribe and seemed like an alright enough player. Though with that said, I just never saw her as a contender to win the season, where even though we got a decent amount of MC on the show by the end of it, a lot of it felt circumstantial, where I felt like we were just seeing her because she was just relevant to what was happening, with her going on the journey, with her getting the Beware advantage, with her like being involved in all this stuff. And while she got a little bit of personal content on the journey that she went on, I feel like outside of that, we didn't really get much of her relationships or position in the game, to where it never felt like the show was going that far out of their way to showcase MC. And again, a lot of her content was because she was just involved in a lot of stuff happening early on the season, to where I was never really impressed by MZ's edit, even though she got a lot of screen time. And her going out here, I feel like makes a lot of sense by the end of it, but obviously she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 10. And before we continue, I am once again partnering up with Russell Muscle TV to promote Idle Plays. Idle Plays is an online shop where you can purchase Survivor puzzles and practice them so that you can be the next challenge beast on Survivor. And with Survivor 50 just around the corner, you can purchase relics from Survivor history with my Creator Camp package, which includes the Labyrinth puzzle, the Slide puzzle, and Spencer's 5-piece puzzle from Survivor Cambodia. If all that sounds exciting to you, feel free to click the link in my description and start shopping now. And with that, we have 9 people left in the game to talk about. As usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But number 9, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is Christina. And this was a change compared to last week. I did decide to bump down Christina, as I did feel like this was a pretty bad episode for her, considering like what she goes through. Where on one hand, she ends up finding an idol in this episode, which you would think would be like this good thing for her, or at least an excuse to give her more screen time and to prop her up, saying how she's going to like use this idol to really turn up her game. But instead, we don't really get that, where while Christina does get a confessional talking about finding the idol and how she's glad she found it with Alex and Steven, it's ultimately Alex that gets the bulk of the screen time for this idol find, where we hear Alex talking a lot about how Christina finding the idol is good for him in particular. And he talks about how like he can use his information to either have the idol play on him or to throw Christina under the bus by telling someone else about Christina's idol, which the fact that we're getting focus on Alex in particular, when this should have been Christina's moment to highlight this idol find, is not a great look for Christina here. It makes me think that Christina is not going to be able to use this idol effectively, that Christina is not important to the story, where instead we're focusing more on Alex, who was just happening to be there when Christina found the idol. So I feel like the fact that Christina like didn't get any opportunity to prop herself up, and if anything got undermined with Alex talking about potentially like using the information against her, is such a bad look to me that I did decide to drop Christina here one spot to where she's now at the very bottom at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have the person who was at the very bottom of last week's ranking, and here we have Sophie S, who did get quite a bit to do in this episode with her going to tribal, with her seeming to have a lot to do with the actual decision here, where we see her being part of this plan to target Rizzo initially, but also cooking up the scheme to throw a vote into Jawan in case Rizzo plays the idol that later gets leaked to Jawan, that later gets back to her, and there is this talk about her being a target, only for that to later shit to MC. And in general, like, this was obviously not the greatest showing for Sophie from a gameplay perspective, where, well, yes, by the end of it, she does get her way in getting MC out. It was also in a spot to where her plan kind of fell through, where despite her having this plan to throw up on the Jawan, which by itself, like, isn't the worst thing in the world, where you do have to at least factor in the possibility that Rizzo plays his idol, the fact that it does blow up in her face is also not that great. And also the reason why she ends up staying, where you have Rizzo explaining that why he wants to keep Sophie around over MC, is that Sophie is just kind of alone in the game, where she obviously doesn't have any connections, whereas MC has like more of this web of connections. And that is ultimately a reason why she is kept around here, even though like there is this talk about her being this physical threat, someone who theoretically could win every challenge, which is ridiculous that we're talking about that this early on in the post-merge here. So again, I feel like there's not a lot to really feel great about for Sophie from a gameplay perspective, where obviously this was not her initial plan to target MC in this spot. MC ends up voting for her at the actual tribal. And even beyond that, like, she's still not in that great of a spot where the episode even admits that she doesn't have many connections in the game. And that's why she's being kept around, which obviously doesn't give me much confidence from a gameplay perspective. But even from an edit perspective, I feel like this episode like wasn't that great for her. I felt like why she got a lot of screen time is because she kind of had to have a lot of screen time because she was a pretty big actor in the actual decision here. That leaves her at least towards the bottom of the list. The reason she's above Christina, though, is that I feel like Christina was more actively undermined this episode, and I feel like Christina's like lack of a good episode is more egregious than Sophie's lack of a good episode, which was enough to have her at least one spot higher, though realistically, not feeling too great about her. So she's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we are once again sticking with the group that went to tribal here, but at number 7 we do have Jawan, who has a bit of a rocky episode here, where he was obviously at least considered a target at a point where Sophie had this plan to throw a vote into him, to where it did seem like had Rizzo played his idol and negated most of the votes, that Jawan would have been in some danger there. Though obviously by the end, like, things later do shift. Though with that said, he doesn't really get his way by the end of it, where it seems like most of his content is him talking about how he wants to target Sophie, how he sees Sophie as this big physical threat, and talks that up a lot, only for him to actually pull the trigger and voting for Sophie, which is obviously not particularly great there, especially when Sophie had talked about like throwing a vote into him to begin with. But it's more so the fact that he contradicts himself, where he says he's going to do one thing in confessional, but then doesn't actually do it by the end of it, is a contradiction and just not great from an editing perspective. But even beyond that, his actual decision to vote for MC here is seemingly not portrayed it in the greatest light either, where it did seem like MC was looking out for him. You even have MC pulling him aside in the middle of tribal to try to plead with him to keep her around, only for him to not go through with that plan either. So I do feel like Jawan didn't have the greatest showing in this episode, or you have him contradicting himself, but even beyond that, you also have him once again being set up as being opposed to Savannah, where you have him calling Savannah a savage at a point, only for Savannah to get more sympathetic content about being on the outs, which makes Jawan come off in a pretty bad light. In general, I am once again on the board of Savannah winning the battle against Jawan, so I feel like for multiple reasons here, I'm just not feeling great about Jawan at this point, to where he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone pretty similar to Jawan at this point, and here we have Sage. And I feel like Sage also didn't have the greatest episode here. We're sort of similar to Jawan. You have her bad-mouthing Savannah by calling her a mean girl and super condescending, only for that to be followed by Savannah getting like this sympathetic content of her like feeling bad for being on the outs. And yes, while you could argue that Sage is correct in her assessment, I feel like the whole framing of this really makes Sage seem like the bad guy here, where she's the one pushing Savannah on the outs and calling her all these mean names, only for Savannah to come out and say, hey, I'm a person, I have feelings. So again, I feel like Sage didn't come off in the greatest light there. And even during the scramble, she also contradicts herself, where she talks about wanting to stick with the Rizzo plan, how she really wants Rizzo out, only for her to not actually vote out Rizzo by the end of it, and doesn't really get her way with the actual plan there. Sort of similar to Jawan and him saying how he wants to target Sophie, but doesn't do so. Though with that said, I feel like Sage at least weighed out more of the options, where she does get a confessional right before tribal, saying how like there's a reason to vote out each of Rizzo, Sophie, or MC there. So I feel like there was at least a little more setup to Sage like actually like being open to voting out MC by the end of it. And I feel like in general, she didn't get as much negativity as Jawan did. But with that said, I still don't feel like that great about Sage. I feel like her prospects are dimming as this poster moves along, and I feel like she's probably going to lose the war by the end of it. But still, I feel like it was enough to have her one spot higher than Jawan here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this person has gone up a little bit compared to last week, though not enough to make him a top contender for me, but at number 5 we do have Alex. And this was definitely a bigger episode for Alex here, where we do see him like talking of a big game, where he obviously gets a lot of focus around the idol hunt. And even though Christina's the one to find the idol, we get his perspective on how he wants to use his information, whether to convince Christina to play the idol on him or to tell someone about it, probably Sophie B in this case. So again, he's at least getting more to do in this episode, and I feel like the show is wanting us to think of him as this big player. Though with that said, I'm just not feeling great about Alex at this point either, where even with him like talking about potentially like telling someone about Christina, I feel like it may end up blowing up in his face to where he could tell Sophie B about it, thinking that it'll rebuild trust with her, only for her to use the knowledge as power and to use it in a way that backfires on him. He also gets undermined as well, to where he talks a lot about how this is an opportunity to get Sophie S out without getting any blood on his hands, only for Sophie S to not go out there. And again, the show just showing him being wrong is not the greatest look there. And obviously beyond that, I feel like even if he is like a competent player, I feel like he's just being presented as this big player that'll be taken out down the road. So I feel like for those reasons, not feeling too great about Alex even after this episode. But it was at least a better episode for him than it was for Jawan or Sage here, to where I did decide to have him above them here on number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this person has moved down a spot compared to last week, but number 4 we do have Steven. And obviously Steven is sort of similar to Alex in the sense that he's being presented as a big player. However, I feel like Steven has fewer red flags in his edit compared to Alex, which is a major reason why I do have him higher. And even so, like, he does, like, get some stuff to do with him, like, being part of the idol hunt, obviously being there when Christina finds the idol. He does talk a bit about how this latest round solidified the lines and how he feels good. However, I still feel like he's probably going to lose the war by the end of it, as I do feel like the edit is setting up the Uli plus Sophie B side to regroup and get the numbers yet again here. So again, that's something at least. And obviously, similar to Alex, I am expecting a downfall for Steven at some point, where while he has been getting some decent content, I feel like he is ultimately being presented as his big player, someone who will be taken out down the road here. However, I feel like the fact that he has less negatives in his edit across this episode compared to Alex was the reason why I did go with him above Alex. However, I'm not feeling that great about him to actually win by the end of it, to where he is here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have yet another big player and someone who got a pretty sizable edit in this episode. But at number 3, we do have Rizzo. And Rizzo obviously got a lot to do in this episode with his group ending up going to tribal. And despite him being like this target that everyone wants to vote for, they're ultimately deterred by him having an idol. And he's ultimately able to get through this round without having to play his idol, which by itself is kind of crazy. Though with that said, I heavily suspect that he would have just been outright voted out had he not had an idol to begin with. Though, again, gotta take what he can get here. And I feel like beyond that, he also gets a decent amount of credit for shifting the target onto MC here, where he talks about how he would rather take out MC here due to her having more connections than Sophie S, and that he's not as scared about Sophie S and sees her as a potential number for him in the next round. Also talks about how he needs to play a more fluid game now that he's at the bottom. And I think with his allies, Savannah and Sophie B also getting decent enough episodes, it makes me think that they are able to like become like these underdogs, are able to turn things around at some point. In general, I feel better about Rizzo than I did before. Though with that said, I still do worry about him coming off as a big player, similar to what we saw with Alex and Jawan. And while I think Rizzo's edit has been better than them, I still feel like he has some holes within him, like the fact that his relationship with Savannah has not really been showcased on the show, or even though people have talked a lot about Rizzo and Savannah being close, we haven't actually seen them like spending much time together on screen at least. So again, I still think there are some worry signs there to where I can't really have Rizzo as my contender at this point, but I think it's enough to have him here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it is the same top 2 as last week. However, I did decide to switch the order yet again. So at number 2, we do have Sophie B. And again, this was a fine enough episode for Sophie B. Now, she didn't get that much to do in this episode, where I believe she only got 2 confessionals across it, where she did get a segment at the beginning talking about her reaction to being blindsided. And she does talk again about how like she needs to be open to cutting Savannah and Rizzo down the road, how she needs to be more flexible by working with Alex. So again, not the most content in the world, but I feel like it's probably fine for her considering she didn't go to tribal here. And I feel like with Rizzo and Savannah also getting set up to coming back together, and also Alex potentially telling her about Christina's idol, I still think there are pathways for Sophie B in the near future to rebound. Though with that said, I feel like the number one person had a better episode than her, to where I did decide to leave her behind here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 49 at this point is Savannah. And I did decide to bump up Savannah back down to number 1 after I dropped her to number 2 last week. And a lot of that coming down to how she came off in this episode, where similar to Rizzo and Sophie B, she got to talk about being on the bottom, how this tribal was a wake-up call, this is her lowest point, and we do see her doing some damage control here. But I feel like the way they presented Savannah was definitely different from how they presented the others, where we see Jawan and Sage talk about how they are planning to target Savannah next, where Jawan calls her a savage, while Sage calls her a mean girl. And this is immediately followed by Savannah getting a ton of personal content here, where she talks about how like she was in a toxic work environment, how like feeling on the outs now reminds her of what it was like being in that work environment as a reporter. She ends up getting really emotional about it as well. And all that is pretty good, especially when she later goes on to win the immunity challenge. Now, I think you can definitely make the argument that this was circumstantial, where it did seem like Savannah was going to be the main target here, only for her to later win immunity, and that a major reason why she got a lot of screen time in this episode was due to that, where they had to show her because she was someone who was going to be targeted until she won immunity. She also gets a ton of screen time after the challenge as well, where she obviously gets to go to the other camp to like be involved in those conversations. So I think you can make the argument that Savannah's content here is circumstantial, and that it didn't feel like that positive an episode for her considering that. But I still think her talking about the toxic work environment and that personal content, her getting emotional, just felt different to me, where it didn't feel like that had to be there. Where even though they had to show her like being targeted and stuff, I feel like her talking about like feeling on the outs and how like this is meant for us to like feel something for her, that didn't feel as necessary. And I think considering like the background that Savannah has gotten up to this point, I do think it could be like this real turning point for Savannah. I didn't feel like the show had to show that, but I felt like they were going out of their way to showcase that, to highlight Savannah there beyond just her like getting all this good stuff happening to her in this episode. So I feel like for those reasons, I feel pretty good about Savannah at this point. I feel like this was a strong enough rebound for her. I also feel more confident in her allies to regain the numbers at this round, where it feels like Rizzo and Sophie B like have these opportunities now to pick up the pieces in the game. And I feel like with them also getting plenty of development on their own, I feel like it is looking pretty good for Savannah. And I think with her getting the most amount of content in this episode, with the most positive content in this episode, I feel like those things really propelled her above the rest of me, to where I did decide to have her back here on number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week once the season has started, where we'll be getting into these players and seeing just how wrong I am about all these people, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm also going to be covering a whole bunch of shows coming up, including The Amazing Race and Hell's Kitchen, so be on the lookout for that as well. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube memberships, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.